All right. We're honored again to be having Vivek Shandas with Newsbeat and This Week in Social Justice. Vivek, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight.
Sure. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, definitely. Vivek, you were great in that episode that we did on redlining and climate. It's obviously a horrific issue. Can you please, for everybody else, we're on the East Coast, our viewers and listeners are spread out across the country. Can you just talk about what you're currently experiencing or have been experiencing over the last few weeks?
Yeah, it's been when I looked about a week ago at my phone and saw the numbers in 111, 112, my mind at first went right to the fact that we are so not prepared for this. Like, this is a classic pandemic experience where we had, folks saying almost a decade ago, we need to have better pandemic surveillance. We need better systems in place to be able to ensure that we are able to develop vaccines quickly and distribute them quickly. And so it's very similar. We see a heat wave coming in. We're all kind of scrambling to try to figure out what to do. In fact, what's interesting is even in my own household, we didn't have air conditioning or anything like that. I hadn't really seen a need for it. And then when we saw this 111 coming up, we were like, oh my goodness, we have little ones in the community. We have not many people in the neighborhood that actually have AC. So we ended up getting a portable AC unit for our bedroom. And we actually, several of us huddled up in there because it was the only place we could be. And neighbors and others were coming over because they didn't have AC either. So we were just kind of hunkering down for a few days. It was pretty rough. And I will just say that as a researcher in this, I have this little infrared camera that I'm able to put into my phone. And I went around taking photos, which I'm happy to share, of what the city looked like during 115 degrees. And the official read, by the way, was 115. And we have sensitive temperature gauges and thermometers that we went around the city, and we actually clocked some neighborhoods at 124. Like,
wow.
it's unparalleled, the level of heat, and unprecedented the level of heat. And of course, those neighborhoods were the neighborhoods I've been watching for a really long time. Those are lower income neighborhoods, Black, African American, Latino, Indigenous, people of color living predominantly in the neighborhoods. And it is one of those classic kind of natural disasters that collide with social marginalization. And we've seen that now in many different respects. The pandemic, of course, was a very clear revealing that. But with this infrared camera, I drove around, took some photos, walked a little bit, and actually took some photos of some camps, some houseless folks who were living in these tents along a major roadway. And I took a photo of just these tents there, and those were coming in at about 137 degrees Fahrenheit, which, as you might know, is lethal for human health. And thinking that people are living in those kind of environment and seeing their kind of silhouettes in the tents, I knew there were folks inside there. It really was kind of heart-wrenching to think how difficult it must be. And many of the deaths that are being identified are likely going to be folks who don't have access to cooling resources. So it's been rough. It's been really, really rough because we're just all scrambling and unable to cope with it.
Now, Vivek, in the episode that that you did with us, that study that you conducted, in a way, you're almost living it, right? These last couple of days. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that study and some of the major findings of that.
Sure. It's interesting. I live in a formerly redlined neighborhood, and so the study has become even more pronounced because of this particular heat wave. And what's really interesting to me is that we were in this study just trying to tease out why we were seeing this consistent pattern across the country of lower income people of color living in neighborhoods that were warmer by measured and empirically validated than other neighborhoods that were wealthier, often whiter. And we were seeing that pattern, and a lot of folks were, saying that this might have to do with various reasons related to the luxury effect, people having more money, being able to pay more for landscaping around their house, their street, etc. But we wanted to really question that and ask whether this is a more systemic thing, and rather than an individual decision being made, we wanted to see, is this pattern consistent across the country. So we looked at 108 cities across the country, used satellite imagery to evaluate how hot specific neighborhoods were. And we used these maps that were done by the University of Richmond, digitized maps of historic redlining, where we'd have A, B, C, and D neighborhoods. A neighborhoods being, quote, the best from a risk point of view, like can we provide a mortgage? Will those mortgages be repaid? Nothing factual about this. This was all race-based. It was all based on who lived there, whether they were white and wealthy. They were often considered the best neighborhoods. B was definitely what D was still desirable. C neighborhoods, as they were graded, were declining neighborhoods, and D were, quote, hazardous neighborhoods. And it was mostly immigrant, low income, and communities of color that were living in those D graded neighborhoods. And we found consistently across the country in the cities that we studied that the D and C neighborhoods were on the order of about 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than their non-redlined counterparts. So the redlining is about the hazardous, drawing red lines around specific neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous, and that's where the term comes from. But the C and D neighborhoods were consistently hotter than that B and A neighborhoods. And so we looked a little further, saw that, of course, the C and D neighborhoods have more freeways through them, have more big box stores, have more industrial facilities immediately next to them. And so all of those things attract or absorb that sun solar radiation, push it back out, and the adjacent neighborhoods really take on a lot of that heat. And we were consistently finding those neighborhoods hotter and less treed, and communities of color living still in those neighborhoods intergenerationally. And so that really gave us pause about the fact that this is not something of an individual decision about landscaping or this or that. It's actually a systemic thing that was promulgated by the federal government and pushed onto local communities and still endures today. And so that's just a quick 3-minute summary of that paper.
Hey, Vivek, I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned in your previous response. This idea that you had to go out and buy an AC unit. Can you explain to people how unusual it is for people in your area in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, to actually have ACs in their homes, and why that is because of the climate? And on top of that, can you just talk about how that is potentially that lack of having maybe the means to get an AC unit could potentially lead to a public health crisis or deaths in these areas?
Yeah, I will first just reference the indigenous communities that have been living here. And in fact, the indigenous communities, there's evidence that it's one of the highest densities of indigenous tribes of any part of North America were living in the Pacific Northwest. And there's a reason for that. I mean, the streams are chock full of salmon, or were, before the big turbines and lots of dams had been put in. The landscape is lush. It doesn't get really below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, doesn't get above 90 degrees very often. It's really this kind of sweet spot temperate zone. And what we're seeing with the turning up of temperatures is that the ecology that sustain large populations are being affected, and the building that we're doing has no code or regulations to be responsive to rising temperatures. And so the building stock that we put in now and continue to put in are all essentially amplifying these temperatures. And so when you get denser neighborhoods, which are really helpful for getting access to goods and services in these dense communities, we're not building those with heat in mind. And so where a lot of high density development goes is also where a lot of lower income renters live. And those areas are hotter. And on top of that, AC units are really, even 10 years ago when we looked at the data, there was only about 30% of the households in Portland that had AC units. If you take it to Seattle, it was only about 15 to 20% of households. Now, since 2012, we've seen this kind of uptick in the number of AC units, central AC units, mostly going into new developments, newer, wealthier developments, higher end developments with these central AC units. And so now we're up to about 56 to 60% AC, central AC in Portland. And so we're seeing this rise in the amount of AC in Portland. It hasn't quite kept up like that in Seattle or Vancouver, British Columbia. And that gets us into the fact that I could go out as somebody who has a day job, has a position that allows me to go and purchase an AC unit, run the AC unit, even in one specific room. And AC, if those listeners that don't know, AC is one of the biggest energy hogs that you could get. You could get a bunch of freezers, you could get a bunch of refrigerators, you get a bunch of toasters and TVs, but you're not going to be running as much as an AC. It's a very energy intensive, and you see that hit on your energy bill when you get it at the end of the month. You'll see how much it demands. And so a lot of communities can't afford to, let alone buy an AC. Places like New York City and other counties gave away ACs last summer because they were closing cooling centers and things like that. Yet being without energy efficiency credits or any programs, running an AC is really expensive. And so being able to get access to an AC unit, and the historic temperate climates here, we're just not prepared. And therefore thinking about an AC has been really kind of a big leap of like, wow, are we there yet? Yes, we're definitely there. This was a wake-up call. And most stores I went to were flush out of ACs. And so even trying to get one, if you could get one, they're on back order. Right. And so we really endured this the best way we could. And I really worry about the neighbors and folks who are older, pre-existing health conditions, those who have had COVID even. We're seeing some evidence that those who've had COVID are being disproportionately affected by heat as well. And so there's some really interesting and important concerning factors that play into the vulnerability of communities when it comes to heat. And AC is one immediate solution, but it's definitely not a long-term one.
Wow. And Vivek, I want to talk about the areas that so you just went into great detail about these neighborhoods and these areas that aren't used to such heat. Mm-hmm. And I want to bring it back a little bit to the redlining and your report. And you talked about these urban heat islands. And something that's always sort of haunted me since our last conversation was that sort of second wave, right? That you described that when at night everyone thinks, oh, okay, it's great, leave the windows open, it'll get a lot cooler. But in these particular neighborhoods, the heat actually rises, right? And it essentially slowly chokes these people to death, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the most, I think, pernicious and concerning aspect of this is the fact that when you see a weather forecast, and I saw those everyone around here is paying very close to them, as well as many other parts of the world and country. You see the weather forecast, and it's one number for a city. And what is really misleading about the way the National Weather Service presents that is that is the overall average for that region. And it takes, for me, the concern, it takes agency away from the fact that Mother Nature, yes, is putting some heat upon us, though what it doesn't necessarily convey is that when you look at it with greater detail, in these redlined areas, in these non-redlined areas, you start seeing differences within one metro region, within one neighborhood, and within one city street. And when we start seeing those differences, and we ask that profound question of why do we see those differences, it allows us to get a little bit of agency about the fact that we actually can ameliorate some of those intense effects of heat on our neighborhoods, on our communities, on our vulnerable populations. And when you get this one monolithic number of a temperature reading, it kind of absolves all of that from being something we can directly change. And so the most hopeful thing that I could say about the fact that we're getting better data about where the hottest places are, its relation to historic planning policies and segregation and racial covenants that have been put in that have removed green spaces, have created denser materials, have created more heat absorbing materials, more larger surfaces that can absorb materials in these redlined neighborhoods. That gives us a little bit of pause of saying, hey, wait, we did this through our decision-making systems. And similarly, we can undo these through our decision-making systems. So the challenge now is to be able to get enough of the momentum amongst the communities, among the decision makers, amongst the vast organizations that work in this, to recognize that that difference in heat is totally self-induced, and that the 124 degree Fahrenheit temperature I recorded yesterday and day before yesterday, it can be actually brought down to about 95 degrees, which is another neighborhood on the same day when we were going out and collecting temperatures. I mean, that difference is all human induced. And it's a difference of life and death when you're talking about that range of temperature. If you have a vulnerable person in a 95 degree neighborhood versus a 120 degree neighborhood, huge difference and big impact.
Wow. Vivek, thank you for your time. We have one last question, if you don't mind. And you mentioned immediate solutions such as, ACs, and if you're able to get that to people's hands, but obviously the affordability once you run them. You're an urban planning expert. I mean, what do you envision for the future of your city going forward? What has to be done to really, change the game in terms of, what's happening with the climate?
Yeah, we can do the short-term, medium-term stuff. Like, let's plant the trees, let's get green spaces in there, let's get communities to co-own those and govern those. Let's really do it from a ground-up perspective. And let's get the paints on there. Let's get the lighter colored rooftops so they can bounce the solar radiation off. Let's get the orientation and the configuration of the buildings so that they better allow air to move between them and that convective current to really reduce the surface temperatures of building materials. Let's do all that stuff in the short term. Let's create block parties so that people could get to know each other and perhaps even know who might be vulnerable on your street during a heat wave and check in on them during these heat waves. Let's do all those things. What I'm keenly interested in are two things in the long term, however. One is to get all the codes and regulations and standards for designing our cities to really recognize that heat is a serious and tragic, yet preventable natural hazard. And that is something we haven't done in any city in the US, and something that can be done just directly through local codes and local governance. So getting those new buildings, getting those retrofit buildings to be more heat sensitive and heat smart, I guess, would be the means by which we can move that. And that's not going to happen unless we get the second part, which is FEMA recognizing that heat is a natural hazard. We have explosions as a natural hazard for FEMA. We have human caused is another category of incident for FEMA. We have, of course, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. But heat is not in there, nor is the pandemic. But heat is another thing we need to be able to get resources to local agencies so that they can do the good work of preparing and reducing the excess